The conventional history of the Great Depression usually begins with a catastrophic week in October 1929. The narrative suggests that a localized financial panic on Wall Street simply spiraled out of control, dragging the rest of the world down with it. But the 1920s global economy was essentially an interlocking mechanical system operating under immense structural pressure. When the pressure grew too high, the system seized up and fractured. The stock market crash did not break the machine. The machine was already built to fail. To understand exactly how a severe recession mutated into a decade-long global collapse, we have to look at the wreckage from three specific angles. We will examine the policy choices of central banks, the structural burdens placed on the laboring class, and the absence of a stabilizing global leader. The events of 1929 provided the initial spark. However, the true engine of the Depression was the structurally flawed international monetary system that turned a localized panic into a global catastrophe. This map shows the highly fragile circular flow of capital that defined the 1920s. American private banks issued short-term loans to Germany. Germany used those dollars to pay war reparations to France and Britain. The Allies then used those exact same funds to service their sovereign war debts owed to the U.S. Treasury. The entire global equilibrium depended entirely on the uninterrupted outward flow of American capital. Operating beneath this capital loop was the interwar gold exchange standard. This system suffered from a structural imbalance known as asymmetric adjustment. Asymmetric adjustment is a mechanism where nations losing gold are strictly forced to shrink their domestic economies to stop the outflow, while nations gaining gold face no reciprocal obligation to expand theirs. The United States and France exploited this asymmetry ruthlessly. By 1930, these two nations hoarded roughly 60% of the world's monetary gold. Instead of allowing that gold to circulate, their central banks sterilized it. Sterilization is the practice of selling domestic securities while buying gold, which actively prevents the newly acquired bullion from expanding the local money supply. By locking up the majority of the world's gold, without allowing it to generate domestic inflation, the surplus nations baked a severe deflationary bias directly into the global economy. They set a mathematical trap that left deficit countries with zero room to maneuver. The catalyst that finally snapped the global system originated here. In 1928, the U.S. Federal Reserve aggressively raised domestic interest rates. Their specific goal was to drain liquidity from Wall Street and combat rampant stock market speculation. This animated diagram illustrates the immediate shockwave. The higher interest rates in New York acted as a massive financial magnet. The vital outward flow of American capital to Europe instantly halted, and short-term loans were aggressively recalled back across the Atlantic. Suddenly starved of capital, European central banks watched gold reserves flee toward higher yields in America. To defend their pegs, European institutions were forced to hike their own interest rates, suffocating domestic credit markets in the middle of a recession. Liberal economic theory frames this as a colossal policy failure. Milton Friedman famously argued that central banks actively destroyed the money supply instead of providing the liquidity needed to keep the system breathing. The interwar gold standard did not act as a stabilizer. It functioned as a rigid, highly efficient transmission belt that directly exported America's domestic monetary contraction into the rest of the world. Under this intense deflationary pressure, the European banking system fractured. In May 1931, the Creditanstalt, Austria's largest universal bank, revealed massive insolvency. Foreign creditors panicked, triggering a localized bank run that rapidly mutated into a sovereign contagion across Central Europe. By July, the panic reached Germany. The collapse of the Danette Bank triggered a system-wide run on the Weimar Republic's financial institutions. Lacking international support, the German government froze its banking sector and implemented strict capital controls, effectively removing the mark from the global gold standard. With Central European assets frozen, international speculators turned their sights on London. The Bank of England hemorrhaged gold trying to defend the pound until September 21, 1931, when Britain was forced to permanently suspend gold convertibility. This scatterplot charts the exact cost of the interwar gold rules. Policymakers were trapped by the Mundell-Fleming Trilemma, the economic law stating a country cannot simultaneously maintain fixed exchange rates, free capital movement, and an independent monetary policy. central banks were legally prohibited from lowering interest rates to rescue failing domestic banks without violating their international gold obligations. But empirical data reveals a stark reality. Nations that abandoned gold early, like Britain in 1931 and the United States in 1933, regained control of their monetary policy and saw industrial production recover rapidly. Conversely, the French-led gold bloc clung to parity and remained flatlined in a severe depression until 1936. Within the rigid architecture of the 1930s, strict adherence to the international rules of sound money essentially required sovereign governments to commit domestic economic suicide. Because nations remaining on the gold standard could not use monetary policy to stimulate their economies, they turned to a different weapon: aggressive trade barriers. The United States fired the first major shot with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. This graphic demonstrates the deflation multiplier. Smoot-Hawley relied heavily on specific fixed dollar tariffs rather than percentages. If a $10 import carries a $2 tax, the rate is 20%. But as the global depression drove the price down to $5, that same $2 tax mathematically doubled into a crippling 40% effective tariff. Deflation weaponized the tax code. The international response was swift. Trading partners retaliated with beggar-thy-neighbor policies, attempting to remedy their own problems by means that worsened the economic problems of other countries. Nations deployed absolute import quotas and competitive currency devaluations, specifically to block imports and export their own unemployment. As retaliatory tariffs multiplied and corresponding banking networks failed, the physical movement of goods ground to an absolute halt across the oceans. These defensive tactics were completely rational for any individual nation trying to survive. But deployed simultaneously, they created a massive collective action failure, wiping out 65% of global trade value, turning recession into a deep depression. A class-based analysis reveals the human cost of these choices. The rigid gold standard violently offloaded the entire burden of macroeconomic adjustment onto the working class through mass unemployment and severe wage cuts. Charles Kindleberger explained the systemic failure through his theory of hegemonic stability. Hegemonic stability theory is the concept that a completely open international economy requires a single dominant power willing and able to act as a stabilizer and lender of last resort. The 1930s suffered from a lethal geopolitical void. Great Britain, deeply indebted after World War I, no longer possessed the economic capacity to stabilize the system. The United States possessed the capacity, but explicitly refused to accept the responsibility, closing its markets and hoarding its capital instead. This economic vacuum forced a political mutation. When democratic institutions failed to protect their citizens from the relentless dislocations of international market forces, desperate populations sought protection in the closed, militarized economies of fascism. The interwar economic collapse was the primary structural condition that permitted the destruction of global democracy and the rapid descent into World War II. In 1944, delegates gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to build a new architecture. The conference functioned as a highly precise, reverse-engineered response to the interwar trauma. This blueprint illustrates the mechanical fixes. To solve the rigidity of the gold standard and prevent competitive devaluations, the architects designed the International Monetary Fund. The IMF established adjustable exchange rates and provided pooled emergency liquidity, institutionalizing the lender of last resort function the interwar system lacked. To prevent another Smoot-Hawley retaliatory spiral, they engineered the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. GATT was designed to strictly outlaw quantitative import quotas and enforce non-discriminatory trade rules across member nations. The new system operated on a compromise known as embedded liberalism. Embedded liberalism is an economic framework that promotes free multilateral trade while explicitly granting national governments the policy tools like capital controls and safeguard tariffs needed to protect their domestic populations from external economic shocks. The architects of the post-war order recognized a fundamental truth. International financial stability is not merely an economic ideal, it is the absolute structural prerequisite